On July 28, 1914, the war that broke out was a European war. By the time most of the major combatants had joined the war, it was a world war. And that's because places like England and France had colonies, and they could draw men from their colonies and bring them into the war. This brought to Europe people that many people in Europe had never seen before, people that they only read about, that they only had seen in movies. But now people of color were beginning to come to Europe and fight on the Western Front. What did that mean for them, and what did it mean for the Europeans who encountered them? Hi, my name is Justin, aka Ghost Reader, and today I'm going to talk about people of color in World War I. This video is part of my series on remembering the First World War, and you can find links to my other videos in the description box below and also at the end of this video. The information presented in this video comes from my reading of Race, Empire, and the First World War, edited by Shantanu Das. So today I'm going to talk about some of those 4 million non-whites who participated in the First World War either as laborers or as soldiers. So the first group I want to talk about are Chinese workers who were brought to France from 1916 to 1918 to make up in the shortage of laborers at places like dockyards and also laborers on the front. Now, China had joined the war and entered on the side of the Entente. However, for financial and logistical reasons, England and France did not want China to contribute soldiers to the war. However, they did allow them to send laborers to their countries in order to make up for the labor shortage. Now, many of the laborers who came over from China were poor peasants, were unemployed soldiers, or lower level civil servants trying to find a way in life. And so they came to Europe to find jobs. These workers were put to work in transportation and munition factories, in digging and repairing trenches, and also in burying the dead. However, these workers were given overtime pay and they were worked for really long hours, so some of the work was unsafe, and so these Chinese workers had to make self-governing organizations to try to look out for each other while they were in France working, and to try to make sure that the employers didn't take too much advantage of them while they were working for the French on the Western Front. The French would also bring in Vietnamese laborers, and they also will bring in Vietnamese troops. So troops from Indochina were brought in to fight as well, and some 48,000 would fight for France during the First World War. And these soldiers who were brought in would fight not only in France, but also in Africa, in the Balkans, and in the Middle East. A lot of these Vietnamese men who signed up to be soldiers and laborers were trying to get away from the economic hardships they faced at home. They were trying to get some freedom from the social norms back at home, and also some of them just wanted to see France. However, the trip over from Indochina to France for a lot of these troops made them disillusioned because the conditions on the voyage from Vietnam to France was quite bad, so a lot of them were disillusioned by the time they got to the Western Front. A lot of these men were put to digging trenches, building roads, and also going out on patrols. India contributed a lot of men to the war effort. So 1.4 million soldiers and laborers were contributed from India alone. And a lot of the people who joined up were from the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and the princes. And this is because they thought that by serving in the First World War, it would help them in their cause to basically get the right to self-govern themselves. However, at first, England refused to send Indian troops to the Western Front. Basically, that was because they didn't think that basically Indians should be fighting in the white man's war. However, with their numbers severely defeated by the first phase of the fighting in 1914, by September and October 1914, 2 Indian divisions had been sent to France to help shore up the British line. And then by December 1915, Indian troops were also being used in the Middle East. In Germany, East Africa, 14,000 Askari or black troops were recruited to fight for the German side. And when the British invaded, these men fought for the Germans and fought pretty well. However, due to the fact of the lack of supplies and isolation, they were forced to retreat. By the end of that 14,000 who did fight in that war, only about 1,200 were left when the Germans finally surrendered in 1918. And for New Zealand, also a Maori contingent was created. Basically, the Maori, about 2,227 of them would join, with about 485 other Pacific Islanders being part of this contingent, and they were sent to Gallipoli. And however, they did not fight as one single unit. They were kind of spread out to serve and help with different units because they didn't have the numbers to do it on their own. So they fought in a battle. They didn't have the requisite numbers to replace them. So the contingent was split up so that they served with other regiments throughout the time they were at Gallipoli. Also, they were men from the Caribbean who wanted to serve, and they were made up the British West Indies Regiment. 16,000 men joined the regiment, and these were men from places like Jamaica, the Honduras, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. They were mostly men who were peasants and of the middle class, and they were formed into labor units. So 9 of the 12 were sent to the Western Front and to Italy, and 3 of the 12 were actually sent to Palestine and actually saw action there. From America, there were 357,000 men who served in the armed forces, and 2 of those divisions went to the Western Front. These 2 divisions did see combat, but not under American command, but under French command, the 92nd and the 93rd, which included the Harlem Hellfighters, which is the famous black regiment, the 369th. This unit spent 191 days in the line, which is the longest of any American unit serving in the war, and for their military service were highly praised by the French army. So what challenges did these guys face as people of color in the First World War? These men were coming to the European continent, and for a lot of people, this was the first time that they were having a person-to-person interaction with people of color. And of course, this stoked some fears in Europeans who participated in the war. For most Europeans, this was not something that was good because Europeans were like the standard for civilization. And to see white men killing each other, they felt that this may lead some of these other races to view them not as highly as they did before. Now, life was not easy for people of color in the First World War. I mean, you had to face racism, and this racism came in different forms. So from the Germans, it was mainly a propaganda racism. They looked across at the French and British soldiers and saw that they were bringing people from other nations, Indians, Africans, and people from Indochina, and putting them in the line as soldiers against German troops. And so their propaganda was all about denigrating the French and British for bringing what they saw as a motley of lower peoples to fight them on the Western Front. The French and British, even though they had these people fighting for them, they themselves had a different form of racism. It wasn't as virulent as the Germans ones was, but it was still there. Theirs was mostly a kind of, in a way, class racism. So for example, in France, the workers, the Chinese and Vietnamese workers faced racism because they were workers and they were in competition with the Chinese and the Vietnamese, not only for jobs but also for women. For the first time, a lot of these people from the colonies were coming in, and they were coming in large numbers, and a lot of white men saw competition there for white women. Now, this was a big fear because a lot of people saw white women as the savior, but also they could bring doom to the white race if they began mixing with people who were not white. And so there were things put into place to try to limit the amount of contact that people from the colonies, Africans, Vietnamese, and Chinese had with white women. And also in some cases they banned them completely. So for example, white nurses were serving people of color who were injured in the war, and in some cases they were completely banned. So in France after 1915, black men were not allowed to have white nurses, and they had to be basically served by men. And in England, Indian soldiers had to always be accompanied by a male staff member. Sir Walter Lawrence, who was the commissioner for the welfare of Indian troops in World War I, was actually quite worried that because of the good care that the Indian soldiers were receiving in these hospitals, that they may actually get in their heads the idea of racial equality. The Americans, when they lent their soldiers to the French troops, they made sure to tell the French that they were not to praise African Americans too much, and also to keep them away from the white women as well. The British West Indies Regiment was actually saw by the British as an inferior native unit, and that's why they didn't see action for the most part. And due to poor conditions, that regiment in Italy actually mutinied. So basically the conditions for people of color led one person to say, "Color largely determined the life of the combatant and non-combatant in Europe, from the theater of promotion and wages within the army to living conditions, mobility, and social interaction." One Indian soldier lamented that when his men had success, it was due to their British officers. However, when they had a failure, it was because of the lack of the fighting spirit in the Indian troops. And this led to some conflict between Indian troops and white troops. For example, after the failure at Kut in the Middle East, some white soldiers actually attacked Indian troops, blaming them for the failure of their actions there. But for a lot of these men, even though they were seen as not good enough soldiers, even though they were not seen as equal people, they still tried to mete out a life for themselves. Some of them assimilated into the culture in which they were introduced to. So some people from, for example, from Vietnam, they married French women and stayed in France, while others went back home and rejected the Western tradition. And those who were in really bad conditions, some of them actually stood up. For example, Vietnamese and Chinese laborers did not just take their poor labor conditions sitting down. A lot of them organized, and they would basically tell their employers about the fact that they would not work unless things got better, and on some occasions they would actually strike. So for whatever reason these men left their homes, whether it's to see someplace they had never seen before, or a sense of patriotism, or a sense of that we fight this, that the people who see us as less now will see us as equals after, because of the contribution in which we're given. Whatever their reasons was for fighting in this war, they fought, they contributed, and they deserve to have their stories heard and to also be recognized for the efforts that they put in. In 1925, the General Association of Chinese Workers asked for a national cemetery for the men who had died as laborers for the French in the First World War, but they were refused. However, in 1988, the French did eventually erect a plaque for them in the Paris Park, recognizing their contributions to the war. A lot of Vietnamese men who worked as laborers, when they returned home, used the skills that they learned to organize the people back home, and some of these skills and the people that they influenced would go on to eventually free the country from French rule. The Askari who fought for the Germans in the war were interned for a short time but then let go. However, they were given no work or income. However, the German government did eventually give them back pay in 1927. Indian troops returned home hoping that their efforts would be seen as a stepping stone to receiving self-government. However, that was not the case, and they would not receive self-government until after World War II. African Americans came back home to their raids. However, when they went to go look for jobs, that's when they met a lot of resistance. From 1915 to 1920, 16 African Americans would be lynched in their uniforms. So as we've seen, people of color played a huge part in World War I. They were laborers, they were soldiers, and they faced the same hardships, if not more, than their counterparts. They were away from home. They were serving with people who at times did not see them as equals. So as we move forward, and a lot of historians are now doing this, they are now looking at people of color and their experiences in the war, looking at their diaries. There are huge amounts of information out there about people of color and their experiences, but for the most part it's been overlooked. However, historians today are looking and delving into it, and as the time goes on, we'll begin to learn more about their contributions and what they thought about the First World War. So if you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos from me, please subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at GhostReads28 and also on Goodreads. The link to that is down in the description box below. So as always, keep reading.